Hello and welcome to this lecture on assessment for learning. My name's Simon Atkinson. So in this lecture today I'm going to run through the objectives. I'm going to talk a little bit about assessment for learning in general terms and spend most of the lecture talking about the 5 stages or strategies that I suggest you consider in your own context, and in doing so think about the cultural conditions. So we're going to look in this lecture at the concept of assessment for learning in fairly broad terms and invite you to think about the nature of your role within it. And in doing so, also to be thinking about the different expectations that students might have of assessment for learning. We all work within constraints, we need to acknowledge those constraints, but we need to be able to think through them and past them in order to enhance our practice. So I'd like to talk to this structure. Essentially I want to talk about assessment for learning, sometimes referred to as a shorthand, not always accurately, as formative assessment. So we're talking about assessment for learning rather than assessment of learning. And we're talking here about processes, the domains in which formative assessment or assessment for learning takes place, and strategies. So the 3 processes, 4 domains and 5 strategies that I'd like you to be thinking about. Now the language is something that you can adapt to your own context. You might want to print out this slide and annotate it so that the language is language that you understand, but I'm going to use particular language which hopefully you'll encounter then through the literature and it will mean something to you. So let's begin with the 3 processes. Essentially assessment is about knowing where the learner is going, where you want the learner to go, knowing where they are currently at the point in which you encounter them in your teaching and learning practice, and knowing or supporting them to get wherever it is they need to be going. So we think about this as a kind of assessment journey. And as already addressed in the conversations around constructive alignment, essentially the intended learning outcomes should be illustrative of that assessment journey. We write learning outcomes, you'll remember, as by the end of this module or by the end of this program students will be able to. That effectively tells them what their destination is. And so the first of those, knowing where the learner is going, is taken account of in the intended learning outcomes, and what we're doing is essentially designing that journey for the student. But we don't do that in isolation. There is a context. And I suggest there are 4 contextual elements that you need to be thinking about continuously. Clearly there's the learner themselves, but there's also the teacher or teachers and the role that that teacher plays. In Kugel's model about the transfer from self to subject to student, to think about the role of the teacher as moving from being what's sometimes referred to as the sage on the stage to the guide on the side, for example. Or in other contexts it may be appropriate for the teacher to remain as the expert practitioner. So thinking about the teacher in the broadest sense. Peers would involve peers in the classroom, but it may also involve work peers. And the syllabus itself, both in terms of what the taught content is, but also what the real-world relationships might be. So the context is quite complicated, but there are those 4 elements, and when one thinks about the 3 processes, or goes on to think about the 5 strategies or stages I'm going to talk about, one needs to be aware of these 4 different contextual players. So let's look at the strategies themselves. I'm going to talk about 5 strategies. The first is locating the learner. So as a teacher, basically making sure that you know and that the learner themselves know where they actually are in their learning process. And there are of course any number of classroom techniques for doing this and online techniques for doing this. There's the process of questioning. There are formal classroom tasks. It might be 1-minute papers at the beginning of a class to have students relate what they've learnt up to this point, whether they've actually genuinely prepared for this particular session. It might be a reading-based task to see whether reading has been done so we know that we're all on the same page. And of course the dialogue that takes place in the classroom allows you very often to determine whether or not students are actually where you think they need to be. Quite often we don't build enough of these techniques into our teaching practice, and we only become aware that students are falling behind or not where they need to be when it's too late. So identifying these as a strategy is all part of assessment for learning. Having established where the student is, we're providing feedback for the student that moves them forward. So the feedback is not simply, obviously, a question of well done, you've got that. It's a question of what are you going to do with it next. So the notion of feed forward, we're going to talk about feedback loops, so the process of students themselves identifying the feedback they want and what they're going to do with it when they get it, so it becomes part of a dialogue. There's the opportunity, of course, to think about how students might feedback to each other as peers, and the idea that the student might themselves feedback on their own work. So as well as peer feedback, we have self-feedback. So we want to think of feedback as a strategy in assessment for learning, as something that effectively has to be about moving the learner forward rather than feeding back on past experience. The third strategy within these 5 is something we might call orientation to success, establishing what the success criteria will be. And peers play a very important part in this. Although the tutor has some oversight, it's important that that success is owned by the learner. It shouldn't be seen as a competition between the student and the tutor, of pleasing the tutor. It should be seen as establishing a common and understood set of criteria between the student and the tutor. And students can do that in some quite interesting ways. They can do that through a process of conversation with each other, in reviewing rubrics, for example. They might look at marking criteria. It may be, in some contexts, that it's appropriate for them to actually design assessment themselves, to actually design their own questions for a written assessment, for example, or to agree the form that their assessment is going to take, all of which will help them interpret criteria and decide whether their response is appropriate. The fourth strategy is one we refer to as peer support. So peer assessment takes any number of different dimensions, but essentially the important thing is activating the resources you have in the classroom. And activating learners themselves as a learning resource is an extremely important part of assessment for learning, helping learners to understand where they are at different points of the journey relative to others, not only in a competitive sense, but also in a sense of genuinely contextualizing the learning that they're actually acquiring. So being aware that there will be other people who have different perspectives and different learning styles is an important part of that process. And really effective assessment for learning is highly inclusive. It will be taking into account those different perspectives, building on those in the classroom, drawing in different styles, drawing in different approaches to learning and to the subject matter and the understanding of the subject matter, having conversations about the language used to define particular concepts or to identify particular notions of success and so on. So language becomes an important tool in the classroom. The final strategy is one of autonomy, and we get into discussions here about the student journey as being one of metacognition, of understanding what one knows and doesn't know, and why one knows what one knows and doesn't know what one doesn't know, but essentially progressing learners to a point where they can do some self-assessment based on a common shared understanding of the orientation to success, based on the feed forward that they've had and knowing where they started. A student should be in a position to document the journey, document their assessment journey, to know where they've come from, know where they are, and know where they're going. And in the process, to manage some of the emotional reaction to assessment, to understand the purpose of assessment as being about evidencing criteria rather than about passing and failing a particular obstacle. And ultimately, this autonomy is about getting students to take ownership of the learning process. So assessment for learning, or formative assessment, is fairly complex when one just breaks it down, but in practice, of course, becomes almost second nature in a good learning and teaching environment. It builds on processes. I've described them here as destination, position, and trajectory. You may choose different words, and it would be worth you, as I say, printing out the blank slide to actually be able to go back and say, okay, that's not the appropriate word for me in my particular discipline. Likewise, in the domains, you may not be comfortable with the terms learner, teacher, peers, and syllabus. You may choose different terminology. But essentially, we have those processes, we have domains, and then we have these important strategies: locating the learner, providing feedback in a way that moves them forward, providing opportunities for them to orientate themselves to success, to know what it is success will look like, using peer support to actually do that in a very effective way, and ultimately develop the skills for self-assessment and autonomy. So the practical things you can do following this lecture and the reading is to identify opportunities you have in your practice to empower your students with respect to assessment. So that notion of empowerment is something that we mentioned with an earlier reading by Nicol and also by Mance York. Think about how you influence these processes, these domains, and these strategies within the discipline constraints that you have. We do have constraints, but we have to be able to see past those in order to be effective. So thank you for your attention. I hope you'll find this lecture useful.